Bom dia a todos e a todas. Muito obrigado aqui pela participação. Então vamos iniciar esse webinário sobre mediação em mobilidade, com especial atenção ao modo MDS, aí criado através de uma cooperação entre a OMF, Open Mobility Foundation, e a cidade de Los Angeles, que agora está se espalhando para diversas cidades. É um prazer ter vocês aqui. A gente está fazendo esse webinário no contexto de uma cooperação, uma parceria entre o CEPESP da Fundação Getulio Vargas e também a Prefeitura de São José dos Campos. Antes de começar, né, eu preciso fazer aqui um disclaimer, né, de que as manifestações expressas por integrantes dos quadros da Fundação Getulio Vargas e pelos convidados que participam dos eventos de transmissão online representam exclusivamente a opinião dos seus autores e não necessariamente a posição institucional da FGV. Reiteramos também que todos aqui presentes concordam em participar desse evento de forma espontânea e, com isso, autorizam o uso de sua imagem para essa transmissão que ficará disponível posteriormente nos canais oficiais da FGV. Então, esse é um disclaimer importante que eu preciso fazer aqui logo de início. Bom, dando continuidade, eu gostaria assim, de agradecer muito aos participantes, a todos os participantes, né? O Paulo Guimarães, que é o secretário de Transportes aqui de São José, nosso parceiro, ao Jascha Franklin da OMF, da Open Mobility Foundation, por dedicar o seu tempo, ao Marcel, que teve que madrugar, porque ele está em LA para participar desse evento, e a todos os do mercado, o Anderson Germano da SERP, o André Fauri da BIP, o Ângelo Leite da Sertel, o Elgio Trindade da Digicom, o João Franqueto da Dataprom, o Pedro Palhares da Movit e o Sérgio Prodóximo da Declink. Então, agradecer realmente a todos os participantes aqui e a todos os que estão assistindo também. Realmente algo bastante bom. A gente tem essa oportunidade aqui. Bom, eu não quero me alongar muito para a gente ter a gente está mais interessado em ouvir as pessoas, mas apenas contextualizar um pouco, né? Essa cooperação, essa parceria entre CEPESP, FGV e Cidade de São José teve uma adição muito importante a partir da Toyota Mobility Foundation, né? E, então eu queria agradecer a Toyota na figura do William, vai falar um pouco sobre a Toyota. E o que a gente está tentando fazer lá? A gente está tentando fazer um modelo de licitação bastante inovador, né? Que seja do nosso conhecimento, ninguém ainda montou um modelo como esse, né? E ele inclui separar a operação do serviço da tecnologia, esse é um dos aspectos, e também criar essa categoria de ônibus responsivo à demanda já dentro do próprio contrato de operação. A tecnologia está sendo, como eu disse, contratada separadamente e de maneira que, dessa maneira especificamente, que seja nosso conhecimento, ainda não ocorreu em outros lugares. O apoio da Toyota Mobility Foundation para permitir essa inovação tecnológica tem sido fundamental, e uma das coisas é esse seminário. Por que para a gente ter alguma maneira de se comunicar de duas mãos com a tecnologia tão relevante? É porque a gente precisa disso para viabilizar esse modelo. O que esse modelo inclui? Esse modelo ele vai ter uma transparência de dados completa, garantindo a privacidade dos indivíduos, evidentemente, mas a gente não pode se ater, para que esse modelo funcione, a conversar, apenas a mandar informações, né, como é o padrão do GTFS, por exemplo, que já é uma maneira de você abrir seus dados, estáticas para as pessoas. A gente precisa mandar e receber, né? Então, acho que o Jascha e o Marcel vão falar mais sobre essa experiência feita com os patinetes, incrível, de que eles podem comunicar se o patinete está em local que não deveria estar, podem fazer uma série de interações com os aplicativos que outros protocolos não permitem, e é um protocolo aberto também. A gente quer, a nossa ideia aqui é levar o MDS para um nível adiante e permitir que ele converse com todos os modais da cidade nesse sentido, tanto receber informação como mandar informação específica, não apenas informações genéricas como já existe hoje em dia, né? Então, isso é o nosso caminho para chegar num modelo de mobilidade como serviço, Mobility as a Service, generalizado para todos os modais, não apenas um modal, como já ocorre hoje em dia com o e-Hail, por exemplo, funcionando como mobilidade como serviço. A gente gostaria que isso fosse genérico para todos os modais, inclusive o transporte público. Então, esse é o avanço que a gente pretende dar em São José dos Campos e, portanto, a participação aqui, essa possibilidade de colaboração também com a OMF e com a cidade de Los Angeles se torna muito, muito importante para nós todos. Bom, eu não quero me alongar, então eu já vou passar a palavra aqui para o Paulo Guimarães, secretário de Transportes de São José dos Campos. Obrigado.
Obrigado, Ciro. Um bom dia a todos. É um prazer, né, estar participando desse evento e fico muito feliz, né, da construção da parceria e da colaboração que a gente tem com a FGV, né, está sendo muito importante para o município essa colaboração, e agora, com o reforço da TMF participando junto conosco desse projeto, eu acho que foi uma entrada muito interessante para a cidade, por vários motivos, né? A gente está construindo um novo modelo de mobilidade e de sistemas de transporte para a cidade em um momento muito especial que o mundo está vivendo, né? A gente está passando por essa crise mundial do coronavírus e o novo sistema que está sendo construído, de certa forma, responde um pouco a essa incerteza do futuro que a gente tem. E dois elementos principais que a gente está trazendo para esse sistema e que nos ajudam, né, e vão nos ajudar a superar e tentar adaptar o sistema de transporte e de mobilidade da cidade no futuro, nesse pós-pandemia, que é a inovação e a transparência de dados, que é muito importante para que a gente possa gerar novos produtos, novas formas de deslocamento na cidade de uma maneira integrada. A cidade sempre teve, né, nessa gestão, 4 eixos principais de sua gestão. E esses eixos têm um vínculo muito forte com a construção desse novo sistema que a gente está construindo em parceria com a FGV. O primeiro deles é simplicidade. Então, a gente sempre visa tornar a vida do cidadão mais simples, né? E a gente também está levando isso para o nosso sistema de transporte público. O segundo é compartilhamento de recursos, usar as nossas estruturas da melhor forma possível. E isso se reflete totalmente no novo modelo de transporte público que a gente está desenhando. O terceiro é inovação, fazer diferente, né? Experimentar coisas novas. E São José tem a inovação no seu DNA. Então a gente fica muito feliz de também trazer um modelo inovador para o sistema de transporte público que já está servindo de referência para outras cidades aqui no Brasil. E por último, a gestão aberta, a transparência. A gente faz isso em todos os nossos atos, né? Desde lá da Secretaria de Educação, a Secretaria de Administração, o nosso portal da transparência, e também levando esse conceito de gestão aberta, de gestão transparente, de abertura de dados para o nosso novo sistema de transporte público. Então, a gente está acreditando bastante que isso vai trazer um grande benefício para a cidade, superar essa crise que está se instalando aí e se instalou no mundo inteiro com o Covid, e mais do que isso, né, retomar o crescimento de demanda do sistema de transporte público que foi se perdendo ao longo do tempo. Então, esse é um ambiente muito favorável. São José dos Campos é uma cidade com 730 mil habitantes, 3 bilhões de reais de orçamento projetado por ano. Então, é uma cidade que a gente tem características de grandes cidades, mas também características de cidades do interior. E essa é uma junção perfeita, no nosso ponto de vista, para que a gente traga inovação e implemente inovação, né? Diferente de grandes centros, onde a gente tem um pouco mais de dificuldade. Então, aqui a gente controla o processo de ponta a ponta, e isso nos permite avançar e testar, e trazendo parceiros como a FGV e como a Toyota Mobility Foundation, a gente acredita que a gente vai produzir excelentes resultados aí para a população local e exportar essas soluções, né, compartilhar esses aprendizados com outras cidades. Então, muito obrigado pela participação de todos e estou ansioso aqui para ouvir aí os nossos palestrantes. Obrigado, professor, e bom evento a todos.
Muito obrigado, Paulo. Agora o William, da TMF, vai nos dar algumas palavras também.
Obrigado. Obrigado, Paulo. Espero que todos estejam bem e saudáveis. Mas, antes de iniciarmos o diálogo, eu gostaria de dar uma perspectiva da Toyota Mobility Foundation sobre a importância de uma plataforma de data como Ciro vai explicar mais logo. E tal como anteriormente explicado, um sistema de public mass é importante para manter o transporte público e a habilidade para empresas privadas poderem participar, operar e coordenar sobre o mesmo sistema e regras. Nós queremos criar novas oportunidades para inovação e novas soluções e, ao mesmo tempo, garantir que o transporte público permanecer funcionando eficazmente. Uma plataforma de transporte comum e aberta que funciona para todos é uma necessidade para gerar todas as formas de mobilidade. E também o governo pode gerar dentro do sistema e através outras municipalidades. Por isso, esse webinar é tão importante para entender o valor do Mobility Data Specification e a perspectiva dos usuários e também a perspectiva e preocupações das empresas privadas. Ao final, São José dos Campos precisa de um sistema que trabalhe certo e que possa ser reproduzido em outras cidades. Estou ansioso para ouvir para todos os palestrantes e participantes. E também por representar a Toyota Mobility Foundation neste diálogo. E sei que esta situação não é ideal, mas eu sei que todos vão contribuir ao conteúdo e nos ajudar a entender o tópico multifacetado que trabalhamos implementar a primeira plataforma do transporte no Brasil. Obrigado a todos e agora eu vou apresentar de novo meu colega, professor Ciro Biderman, o líder desta iniciativa. Obrigado. Ciro?
Obrigado, William. Nós agora vamos já dar início aos nossos principais convidados, né? Então, vamos começar aqui com Jascha Franklin, da Open Mobility Foundation, que vai nos explicar um pouco a ideia do MDS e os próximos passos que eles pretendem dar com esse protocolo que está já mudando um pouco a maneira como se administra o transporte no mundo. Jascha, muito obrigado mais uma vez, e the floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you, Ciro, and thank you, William, for having me here. I'm very excited to share some of our work with you. If you allow me 1 minute, I will share my screen. Okay, hopefully people can see my slides here. So I'm going to give you an introduction to the Open Mobility Foundation and the Mobility Data Specification, and then Marcel Porras from the Los Angeles Department of Transportation is going to talk afterwards about how these technologies are being put to use in the city of Los Angeles. So to start, something that we all know is that transportation is changing. There are, in the last 10 years, there's been an explosion of new modes of transportation, new types of vehicles, new form factors, new business models. And these have come to cities around the world, often quite suddenly, often without a lot of advanced planning. But they've started to change our behaviors as we move around cities. And you see this when you look at the growth of ride-hail services like Uber and Lyft, in the United States in particular, that have seen this steady growth from small minor services to really a significant portion of the overall transportation system. We've also seen this with micromobility, especially with the introduction of electric scooters, where the idea of rental bikes, which have been around for a while, has suddenly seen this massive increase in usage of both electric devices and manually operated devices. And this change is not slowing down. We have, if we look onto the horizon, we see many new modes, new services that are being piloted and tested now throughout the world, whether it's delivering people or goods through automated vehicles or aerial vehicles. We're in a moment of really profound change in our transportation system, and that is going to continue for the foreseeable future. The challenge, though, that cities in particular face, and any government that is trying to manage this, is how to steer this change towards good outcomes for their communities. Many of these changes are exciting and potentially very beneficial, but there are also risks that come with all of this disruption. And so what cities are starting to do is ask themselves what their priorities are. What do they want to see on the other side of all of this as these new services are introduced? And when I look at the policy goals that cities have prioritized, it typically comes down to these four big ideas. Cities want transportation systems that are safe, that are equitable, that are accessible to people, whether it's a result of, for people who have physical limitations or economic limitations. And they want systems that are sustainable. They want systems that are not going to contribute to the further warming of the planet. And in fact, we have a lot of work to do to reduce the overall greenhouse gas emissions of our transportation system. So the challenge with all of these new services is how do we manage and regulate and steer them towards these goals? And if you think about how we have traditionally managed our transportation system, we have infrastructure like this. We have parking meters, signs, gates, physical infrastructure that is the tools of management. And these are not going to go away. We still need these kinds of traditional infrastructure. But we are going to have to adapt that physical infrastructure. And you have organizations like NACDO, who here in the United States, who are doing an incredible amount of work to envision what the street of the future is going to look like, if it can accommodate autonomous vehicles, if it can accommodate robot devices delivering packages, if it can center around the needs of people and transit rather than around private automobiles. So there's a lot of work going on to reimagining the physical infrastructure. But almost as important, we believe, is that there needs to be digital infrastructure that helps government manage public space in the future. So many of these new modes are digital by nature. They are built around smartphones and connected devices. And we think that that presents an incredible opportunity for governments to bring the same technologies that are enabling these new services to bear in the act of governing and managing those services. And so that is what the Open Mobility Foundation seeks to do. We want to help build the digital infrastructure to help cities manage public space for the public good. And we do that primarily through the use of data standards and open source software. We don't think that either the public or private sector can determine the future or should determine the future of our transportation system by themselves. So we seek to work in collaboration and create a space where public and private can come together, and they can co-create the new tools that are going to enable this future transportation system to emerge. Now, some of our work is about creating technology, but it's also about building relationships, because there is a lot of learning that we all have to do about what this future is going to look like. And so creating a space where we can build strong partnerships and mutual understanding between public and private sector is essential to advancing that collective sense of understanding. We are structured as an organization as a nonprofit open source software foundation. So if you're familiar with open source, you may know some of these organizations on the right, Mozilla, Apache, Linux. These are the big open source foundations. We are much smaller than any of these, but the model is similar, which is that we bring together multiple stakeholders to create open standards and open software that is freely licensed, available to anyone, and that is built around the idea that by openly licensing things, that we can actually help create a sustainable business ecosystem around this technology that is ultimately beneficial for both public sector and private sector. We are a membership organization, so we have both public sector members as well as many private sector members, and some support from philanthropies who help fund our organization. So you can see this is just a snapshot of some of our cities and companies. We have about 30 public sector organizations, mostly in North America, but a few in other parts of the world. And then we have 10 private sector companies that have all joined, along with a number of partner organizations that we work with. The thing that we are most known for is the mobility data specification. And what this is a language that allows for cities and mobility companies to interact with one another and to exchange information about transportation services. So it allows, for example, cities to get information about the trips that are being taken on micromobility devices, not about the people who are taking those trips, but about the movement of the vehicles themselves. It allows cities to see where vehicles are being deployed by companies, how many of them they are, whether they're being deployed in places they should be or not. It allows them to measure equitability of deployment around the city. It also allows cities to publish their regulations in a digital format back to the companies. For example, where riding a scooter might be prohibited, or where there's a special incentive to place a vehicle. And so what this is done by using a standard API, it's now in use in over 90 cities around the world in at least 12 different countries. And it's created two things that we think are really essential. One is that there's a whole marketplace of technology companies that have emerged to offer tools to cities to work with MDS data. So if you're a city, you do not have to build all of your own systems yourself. Instead, you can hire a company that to take data in MDS format and give you dashboards and visualization and analysis tools. Similarly, what it's allowed is it's sped up the process of launching these new mobility services into cities. Because for a company, if you're a scooter company, let's say Lime or Bird, you don't have to go to each city and negotiate exactly what data you'll share on a city-by-city basis. Instead, you can show up and you can say, we want to share data. We're going to use the standard format that's in use all around the world. And it's a very easy thing to turn on that data feed for a new city. So it's accelerated that pace of adoption and deployment of new mobility services. I'm going to talk a few more examples about how this works in a second, but I just want to talk about how we as a foundation work, because it is important to our identity as an open source organization. So we are led by cities. Our board of directors consists of senior city leaders, but we have strong private sector participation in our governance as well. Everything we do is public and freely available. If you go to our GitHub page, you can see everything we're working on. You can see our plans for the future. And we invite contributions from anyone and everyone who has something that they want to add. We have working groups that you can see, we do these regular Zoom meetings. They've gotten bigger since the screenshot was taken. We typically have 20 to 30 people now on each of these calls where we work through technical details and make decisions about new features and what to add. And so it is all being built through that public-private collaboration and through open licensing models that allow anybody to use this. So what does this do? Why is this even useful? Well, I'm going to go through some examples. I talked about a few use cases already, and I know Marcel is going to speak more about what they're doing in Los Angeles. But some of the ways that cities are using MDS, they're using it to help with infrastructure planning. This is a visualization from a city in the US that mapped all of the scooter trips that touched on a particular road that they were planning to rebuild, so that they could understand how the design decisions they made about that road, whether to put bike lanes on it, how to make connections to other parts of the city, they could understand how those changes would impact travel from people who maybe didn't live near the road but used it as part of their journey. So we see a lot of this sort of data for infrastructure planning and analysis. We're seeing cities develop their mobility policies with the assumption that they will have access to detailed, very up-to-date, high-fidelity data about the services that are rolled out. And that's different from how things usually work. Typically, policies get written, and then at the very end, the technologists get told, okay, here's the policy, go implement it. Instead, what we're seeing is laws are actually being written with MDS baked right into the law, so that cities know from day one that they're going to have access to this data and can start to plan their implementation around the idea of continuous measurement and iteration and improvement over time. And so that means that cities can do things like write policies that are more dynamic than they might otherwise be. As an example, many cities limit the number of micromobility devices that are in their jurisdiction. But instead of just setting a hard number, many cities are allowing that number to fluctuate based on the actual utilization of vehicles. So if they measure through MDS that many vehicles are used, then they can allow more vehicles into the right-of-way. If they're seeing that vehicles are not being used and they're sitting idle, they can reduce the number that are allowed to manage the supply and demand. That's something that's only possible with this sort of access to fairly real-time data about services. Cities are writing their regulations and publishing them in digitally native formats. So cities are defining the places where speed is restricted or parking is not allowed, and they're publishing that through MDS back to the operators, so that it's not if there's for example, a special event or a road closure, that information can be transmitted and updated within all of the apps of many different mobility providers in real time, and can be adjusted frequently as cities' needs change or as their analysis shows that they need to manage their transportation system differently. The traditional way to do this is to publish a PDF once a year that has a bunch of maps in it, and then everybody has to translate that into their own applications. Now it can all be automated through an API. Cities also use this to measure compliance of operators with the rules that they publish. So the combination of digital regulations and data about vehicles allows cities to do analysis like this. This is from the city of Chicago, where they created a no parking area around a very large concert that they had last year. And then they measured whether the operators complied with the rules around where the scooters weren't supposed to be. And you can see there was some compliance. It was not perfect. But this does two things. It allows cities to make sure that companies are playing by the rules and not to have staff on the ground who's going around looking for violations, but instead they can look at it from a central location. It also allows cities to understand, partly they wanted to see compliance, but also they wanted to know, were people using scooters to get to this concert? Because if they are, that may mean that next year they need to adjust the policies. Maybe they need parking zones for scooters that are designated places, or other resources to help encourage people to use these vehicles responsibly to get to the event. We're starting to see cities experiment with market incentives to produce outcomes. So as an example, the idea of starting or ending a scooter trip near a transit station, that could come with a discount. That's something that most cities want to incentivize. Micromobility is potentially a very useful way to extend the reach of transit systems. So by offering pricing incentives, it creates the opportunity to encourage the combined use of these different systems and technology. And so that's another example of where having access to high fidelity data and the ability to publish regulations digitally gives cities really important new tools for policymaking and management of the system. So those are just some examples, but as Ciro has talked about, we are thinking about this far more than just micromobility. And so we have actually started in the last few months to look at how we expand the reach of MDS and the model that we've built for micromobility to other aspects of the transportation system. One area that we have recently started to look at is around both ride-hail and robotaxis. We have both Ford autonomous vehicles and Waymo are members of the OMF. And so we're looking at the ways that cities and companies that are transporting passengers in more traditional vehicles can exchange data. There are some aspects of MDS that can be potentially applied directly to these services, and other things that will need to change to accommodate these different modes. We're starting to work on this challenge of curb management and curb digitization. Cities recognize that, especially in central business districts, the curb is one of the most sought after pieces of real estate. It's essential for so many different services and activities that take place. And it's often very poorly managed. Many cities don't have a digital representation of the curb space, what the rules are, where parking is allowed, where pickups and drop-offs are allowed, or goods delivery is allowed. And so cities are starting to digitize their curb and think about how they can bring more dynamic and active management strategies to this space. But there is a need for data standards. There's a need for digital infrastructure to enable this approach to curb management. And so we are starting to both build some things and engage with others who are working in this space to try to create some standards around this. Freight and logistics, and especially in the COVID-19 world where people are getting more things delivered, this is an incredibly important part of the urban transportation system. How do we move things, goods, through our cities in ways that don't contribute to congestion, in ways that make efficient use of the resources that we have? And so we have a number of different pilots that cities are doing, some of them with vehicles like electric bicycles as a delivery mode. We also have cities that are starting to experiment with automated goods delivery vehicles. There's several cities in the US where sidewalk robots that move along are being used, are being tested. And we're seeing those cities start to adapt MDS to allow them to understand how these new form factors are being put into place. And lastly, we are starting to look at road pricing. This is something that's not common in the United States yet, but many cities are looking at the possibility of using pricing as a management tool, whether that's defining a congestion zone where there's an additional fee to drive into it, whether that's using pricing in the context of the curb and potentially, as an example, charging Uber or Lyft for each pickup that they do in a central business district. We think there's a lot of interesting opportunity around markets and pricing tools as a way to do digital management of the transportation system. And so we're in the very early stages of looking at ways that we could be potentially helpful in that. So we have a lot of work to do. We've sort of started with micromobility and really tried to prove the value of this model and build that public sector, private sector collaboration. And as we look forward, we are identifying other places where that model can expand and where we can bring that to bear for our members. So I will stop there. I think unfortunately, I do have to leave before the end of this webinar, so I think we may be doing some Q&A with me now, but I'll turn it back to our host to tell us how to proceed.
Muito obrigado pela apresentação, Jascha. Eu acho que esse é um projeto realmente fantástico e nós temos que caminhar nesse sentido. Como o Jascha tem uma outra reunião e vai ter que nos deixar em breve, eu vou fazer as perguntas agora, o Q&A, vou fazer ele agora, para o Jascha ter a oportunidade de responder, né? Eu vou resumir um pouco. É uma pergunta do Vinícius Macedo. Ele está perguntando aqui que as iniciativas de patinetes, que foi você se concentrou na sua apresentação, elas são um pouco raras ainda no Brasil, sobretudo depois que a Green e a Yellow, que se juntaram, elas deixaram algumas cidades, não deram continuidade, né? Então, a pergunta dele em relação ao uso de patinetes não é exatamente o que vocês fazem, mas talvez você tenha algo a dizer para ele, que é o que precisa para a iniciativa de patinetes ter certo nas cidades brasileiras, eu imagino, o que é necessário para isso. O Felipe escreveu direto em inglês, ele estava sendo que when you presented the Open Mobility Foundation's partner, most of them, if not all, were big cities in North and South America. Even talking about an open source platform, it seems that some sort of expertise is necessary for local governments to be part of the project. What is the minimum amount of technical staff and with what background required to be part of a project like this? Então, ele está querendo saber se vocês entendem que as cidades teriam que ter um staff mínimo para conseguir entrar adotar o MDS, o MDS e se associar ao Open Mobility. Posso fazer, tem mais duas perguntas, acho que vou te deixar responder, que senão fica muito acumulado.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know for the first question about how, what it will take for scooters to become more commonplace in Brazil. I will say I don't think I'm the best person to answer that question. I don't have a great sense of what the challenges may be in the specific market for that. But I would say that the model that we are deploying with scooters has relevance in a lot of other modes of transportation. As we see more private companies starting to offer services in cities, it becomes important that we find ways to say yes when they want to come in and offer a service, but also that we do it in a way that protects the public interest. And I think that tension is at the heart of what MDS is all about. And it applies to scooters, but it applies to any other mode of transportation that is operated by a private company on a for-profit basis, where government needs to provide management, they need to provide oversight and regulation. And so we think that this model can be applied in other contexts, whether scooters are a mode or not that is particularly popular. The second question about minimum level of technical expertise. So we see this as a spectrum. As I said, there are more than 100 companies, 100 cities, or about 100 cities that are using MDS right now around the world. Some of those cities, and you'll hear from Los Angeles, right, have incredible technical sophistication. They have software developers and data analysts on staff. Some of those cities have nobody with deep technical expertise. They maybe have one or two people who are charged with managing a micromobility program. Sometimes it's thousands of devices that a single person is responsible for managing. But what they're able to do is use MDS through a third-party software companies. So there are companies like Ride Report or Lacuna or Blue Systems, those are all members of OMF, who will sell to a city a software package that allows the data from MDS to be collected, analyzed, visualized, presented, so that the person who's managing the program doesn't need any technical expertise in order to interact with the data. They can use a web-based system to ask questions and create reports and do analysis. So there's really a broad spectrum of technical sophistication for using MDS. In terms of contributing to MDS, most of the cities that participate in our working groups and who offer code on GitHub, they have at least one person who is fairly technical within the organization. But we really try to structure our work so that people can contribute with whatever they bring to the table. And sometimes what they're bringing is policy expertise, not technical expertise. But that policy expertise is incredibly important for helping make sure that the technology we build actually serves the needs of the people who are implementing and developing mobility policy in a city. So we really try to make space for any city or any organization to contribute to MDS.
Thank you, Jascha. Since you're running out of time, we will not accept new questions, so I try to respond to the questions that are done already. Eu deveria falar em português para traduzir. Bom, eu só vou responder as questões que estão postadas, a gente não vai pegar mais questões. Bom, o Fabrício tem uma questão bem técnica. Ele quer saber como que ele dialoga, o MDS dialoga com outros standards internacionais, como ITXPT ou ISO 24014. Eu adicionaria GTFS, enfim, como que ele dialoga com esses outros protocolos.
So at the moment, the MDS is a fairly standalone standard. So we have not, we haven't been part of the ISO process, but we tend to we try to build with building blocks that connect to other technology systems that cities are using. So, for example, if cities have a GIS platform, we've tried to develop our tools in such a way that it's easy to take a map of regulations from a GIS system and bring it into MDS. We also do have some collaboration with the GBFS standard. So GBFS is used for it's a companion to GTFS, but GBFS is used to help aid in discovery of mobility services of bike and scooter services on mapping applications. And we collaborate with the organizations that manage GBFS to create alignment between our specifications about how we describe vehicles and how we describe places. So the idea is that if you are using one of these standards, that it's very easy to adopt the other alongside of each other. I think over time, as we start to expand beyond micromobility, we'll need to do more alignment with some of the other data standards that do exist, and in particular, some of the standards around transport. And that's something that will be part of the ongoing work of our organization in the months ahead.
Now from Rico Munoz, he's interested in knowing more about curb management, and he has two questions. Which companies are part of OMF? If curb management companies are partner with OMF, and the timeline for implementing curb management into MDS.
It's a great question. So we have a few of our member companies are starting to work on curb. We at this point don't have any fully dedicated curb management companies who are members, although we are talking with them. But we do have a number of our companies like Microsoft, which has a whole mapping division and tools for connected vehicles, Waymo, Ford, who are very interested in curb management as it ties directly into their businesses. We're in the very early stages of this, and actually before I got on this webinar, I will have to leave a little early to go to a board meeting for the OMF, and I was just finishing the slides for our curb management discussion that we'll be having today. So I think the answer to that question of timing is still in process, but I expect that in the months ahead that we will begin to explore exactly where we think we can add the most value in terms of curb. There are other efforts underway in the curb space, and we don't, our goal is not to create competing standards, but rather to find the places where there are not yet standards, or where creating a technical space for the things that cities are learning as they start to experiment with curb management, the things that companies like Waymo are experiencing as they start to deploy their vehicles. We want to create a space where those discussions can happen and that understanding can be developed so that we can find the places where we can deliver the most value. So the short answer is we're working on defining exactly what that looks like, but I think we'll get started with that early discovery work in the next few months.
Thank you, Jascha. There is a very important question from Guillermo, and this is on, you want to know, how is the kickoff? A city wants to join OMF, how do you kick it off? And how can we make it happen here? And São José will be probably the first one to make it happen in Brazil.
Yeah, well, we'd love to have you as members. So you can send me an email or fill out the contact form on our website, and we'll get back to you and talk. Becoming a member for a city is very straightforward. It's a single-page application form. There's no cost to public sector organizations to join. Then we would work with you to talk about how you want to be involved, whether that's at the technical level or just being a user of MDS or to participate in other events that we put together. So we're very excited to welcome new members in, and please reach out, and we will help guide you to becoming part of the organization.
Ok, muito obrigado. Eu vou mantendo o nosso cronograma. Eu agora vou passar a palavra para o Marcel. A gente já sabe que em algum momento você vai ter que ir, infelizmente, Jascha, mas acho que vai dar para você assistir um pouquinho do Marcel aqui, compartilhando com a gente a experiência pioneira de LA. Marcel, uma vez mais, muito obrigado por aparecer aqui, esse horário do dia. Então, the floor is yours.
Obrigado, Ciro. E obrigado, William, para também me convidar. I'm going to speak, vou falar agora em inglês. Para a gente que não sabe, eu tenho família brasileira. Meus pais são colombianos, mas tenho família que migrou ao Brasil nos anos 50, 60, que moram na Brasília. Eu também tive a fortuna de estudar lá, estudei na PUC do Rio e também fiz a linguagem na FGV em São Paulo. Também fiz um estágio no o que é o nome de Logitrans faz muito tempo. Então me agradeço muito a oportunidade para estar aqui com vocês e compartilhar a experiência de Los Angeles. Mas agora vou trocar para meu inglês. Obrigado. So let me screen share. Here we go. Pode ver? Can you guys see?
Yeah.
Okay. So we've a little bit about myself. I've worked in the city of Los Angeles for 12 years. I started working for a city council member by the name of Eric Garcetti. who is now our mayor. And so I've had the opportunity to work for city councilman, for the mayor, and in the last 4 years, I've been working for the Department of Transportation. And so I have a really unique perspective of being in a political office when we started to see the transportation disruption starting to happen. And I'm thinking about Uber and Lyft, and really seeing how that could change mobility patterns in a city. And so really had that opportunity to experience that. And so when the second wave of disruption happened via the scooters, I had already some lessons learned from being in there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the LA experience. If you want any more information about just the department, there's a website here on this page that you can take a look at. Some of the presentation is also referencing a report that we recently published that looks at the whole program, and I will share the link to that report so that it goes further in depth. It's about 180 pages in total. So really quickly, as we look at our role as city government, and particularly within LADOT, I think we see ourselves as having multiple functions. One is planning, one is around regulation, and particularly looking at kind of right-of-way management and the role of the traditional Department of Transportation, and then one of operations, right? So how do we actually make sure that the right-of-way is being effectively managed to achieve the outcomes that we'd like to see? And we do this all through the lens of kind of social and economic equity, understanding that mobility and access are opportunities for economic development, for quality of life, et cetera. So as I mentioned, in the LA story, I think scooters happened very quickly when you think about how, when you compare them to the Uber and Lyft experience. And some of it was just, and I think on top of it, the impact was visibly, or it felt more intense, because as a society, I think we've become used to just, that's a car, there's traffic, no big deal. That's just life, right? And so, but when you saw the explosion of micromobility in this country, it happened really fast, right? Particularly in major cities like Los Angeles. So over the course of the first year, and that was approximately, we hit a year of the pilot program this past March, we permitted about 37,000 single devices in the city. We saw approximately, around 10 million trips in the first year. And with MDS, we were seeing 4 million specific data points a day. Just kind of give you an understanding of the activity that we're tracking and the granularity of what we're collecting to help us inform and manage the program. As you see down here, we permitted around 37,000. We never saw more than 18,000 vehicles on the street. And I think it's just an indicator of the market, right? I think folks, companies speculated in terms of the number of vehicle permits that they were going to use. Again, speculative. It could have been also just to display growth within their own models. In January, we kind of saw the lowest deployment. Subsequently, that has changed. We saw a huge drop off that you'll see later as a result of COVID. So here's kind of the total trips compared to average daily trips. And so you saw here in Los Angeles, our summer months are June, July, August into September. And so, this also was corresponding kind of with our tourist season. And so you see really big spikes, coming down into December, which is our winter months. And then you started to kind of see that increase starting to go up again. And then you saw COVID happen, which was a huge drop. Several companies just stopped operating altogether. But we've subsequently seen a rise again in scooter deployment. But again, when you look at it, and I'll get this critique from transportation researchers, 1.2 million trips in a month, regardless of how you slice it, those are trips that are not. It's taking from walking trips, it's taking from transit trips, but it's also taking from car trips, right? And so while it may not be comparable on the large scale of all the trips that are happening every day in Los Angeles by automobile and by transit, I think it kind of is a demonstration of the impact and the potential that this mode could have. So here's a snapshot. This is a little bit older, but this is what an MDS allows me or LADOT as a regulator to observe in terms of activity in the city. And this is really important, and understanding where these vehicles are was really a big reason we were allowed to permit as many as we did. We only walked away with, I mentioned, around 37,000 permits for individual vehicles. But when we presented the program to the city council and the mayor, there was no limit on the number of companies, and each company could have up to 10,500 vehicles across the city. At one point in time, we had 10 operators in the city, and so when you think about that, we could have had over 100,000 dockless scooters and electric bikes circulating in the city. And so this, as many of you who work for cities know, I did not have time to go and hire new staff, right? I had to, and particularly to allow a program like this to grow the way that it grew, I needed to bring Jose, who manages bike share. I needed to bring Robin, who manages mobility hubs. I needed to bring Anita, who handles car sharing. I needed to bring my team members who were working on other projects into this program. And we needed to be equipped with tools that allowed us to be very precise with our management of the program. And this was enabled by the creation and the adoption of the mobility data specification. And at the time that we created it and adopted it, it was very much an LA City project. It was something that was done in collaboration with LADOT staff, staff in our sister department, the Information Technology Agency, and with consultant support. So we had some consultant support, and we continue to have it, that we're thinking not about scooters, we're thinking about autonomous vehicles. And so, so when scooters happened, we were able to take this really, 10-year horizon thinking about autonomous vehicles, and working internally with our city family, we're able to develop a version of MDS that could be launched immediately. And so once we had that, we started to evolve, because it's one thing to know where the cities are, but it's another thing to know where they're being disruptive and impacting the quality of life for Angelinos. And so the other element that we did, I don't know if in Brazil you have an equivalent to 311. So, we have 911 for public safety, for police and fire, but very common in cities in the United States is for there to be a 311 number to call for city services. So if you need your tree trimming, if there are bees, if you have to pick up more trash in your neighborhood, this is what you would use. You know, you could call or you could use an app. And so this is a screenshot of the app. One of the things that we did really early on was work closely to integrate a dockless mobility enforcement service request. And so the main one that we did was around parking compliance. And so in the first year of the pilot, we received over 12,000 complaints, and where 90% of those requests were related to improper parking of the vehicles. So for those of you who care about sidewalk accessibility, curb ramp accessibility, or to be able to leverage your like civil society to help inform your enforcement, this was very important. Constituents were able to take a photo and the metadata would have the lat long of the complaint. And so we were able to map this along with activity, and it was able to help us as a team be smart with our enforcement. The good thing is these complaints from constituents, there was a requirement for all of the companies to integrate this service request function into their backends. And so as soon as a constituent put a complaint, it went straight to the operator, and the city had a dashboard where we were able to track how long it took them to close out the service request. And about approximately 68% of the complaints were resolved within a 2-hour window. Here's another use case. I think Jascha mentioned, talked to this a little bit in his examples, but in the Los Angeles use cases, one of the areas that was most impacted by dockless mobility was Venice Beach, right? As we mentioned, tourist season, Venice is always iconic. If you've ever come to Los Angeles, you've gone to Disneyland, you've gone to Hollywood, and you've gone to Venice and Santa Monica. And so it continues to be that way. And Venice's street grid lends itself. It's smaller streets, it's compact. And so it lends itself to micromobility. And so one of the things that we saw, it was that there was just an overcrowding. We didn't have any requirements, density restrictions. And so at the peak of this, in the square area, we had 6 operators operating, and we had close to 3,000 devices in a square mile. So it's like 2 kilometers. When you look at best practices for bike share, you see about 360 bikes per square mile. So this was almost 10 times the recommended network density that you would want in an area. And so what we ended up doing was going in and placing a restriction of 120 vehicles per operator. And we specifically created parking locations that they had to deploy in every morning. So every night, they would have to rebalance their operations. And so we went from approximately 3,000 vehicles to a little under 1,000 vehicles. And as we continued to measure it, we actually saw a higher vehicle per vehicle utilization. So we saw the same amount of trips in total with under 1,000 scooters than we did with 3,000 scooters. And so it showed us that it was we were able to enhance and better manage the right of way while having negligible or almost no impacts on mobility in that geography. And if operators were found to be in violation of their number, because we would do physical audits, then the penalty for violating your deployment numbers was you would be suspended from the geography or the special operation zones for 7 days. So that's kind of like an operational use case. I think this is going back to the Jascha example, so I won't spend too much time on it. This was also just trip segment, looking at density, the most used corridors for the trips in Venice Beach. I think what you don't see over here is this was actually the boardwalk, this black area, and we put a geofence restriction. And so if vehicles entered the boardwalk, which is a lot of pedestrians, then they were required to throttle down. So there was a geofence on this corridor. And so that's why I think you see such high utilization along this parallel corridor. We used this also, did this analysis in downtown LA. And in one of the things that this led to actually was because we had this analysis and we were collecting fees from the operators. And I'll tell you, we collected around close to $4 million in permit fees. We used some of that money to pay for the operations of the program, but to reinvest in infrastructure. And so previously, this road was very damaged. It was hard to ride, and there was just a regular bike lane. Using the revenue from the vehicle fees, we were able to reinvest this, and we did this summer to do a quick kind of build infrastructure for the project. So that's kind of the use case examples. We have the planning example, we have the regulatory example, but I think one of the things that I would is important if you all have not also already engaged in this type of discussion is the role of the city and their ability to collect data. And so we've come under fire. I think local jurisdictions have come under fire because of the granularity of the data that we're collecting. And there's been a lot of arguments about why us having the ability and the right to collect that data, because of the ability for that data to be used to identify specific people's travel destinations, origins and destinations. And so I wanted to be very clear here in this slide that this is the universe of data tied to a dockless scooter operations. Up top is the data that is collected by the company. So when you think about it, they're getting from their employees or gig economy workers, their social security number, their tax information, their bank account. For their riders, they're getting their name, their address, their cell phone, their credit card, their driver's license, their birth date. This is really sensitive data, right? For the city, we only care about the vehicle data, right? And we care about like where is the vehicle, and specifically we only care about the vehicle data when it's on the public right of way, when it's on the sidewalk, when it's in the street. If the vehicle is in someone's home charging, or if it's at the warehouse, we're not looking for that data. And so I think this has kind of been one of the key pieces that that has been really where we've had to lead. And I think going back to the example that I gave you, or the anecdote that I gave you, that when this all started, I was in the mayor's office when Uber and Lyft came to Los Angeles. And over the course of multiple years, trying to work with private mobility disruptors, tech companies, Los Angeles and cities in California did not have regulatory authority over these companies, and it was done by the state. And despite multiple efforts to try to work to get data to enforce planning or to do enforcement, we were unable to do so. And so when this came around, I think it was really important for us to not repeat the mistake of the past. And so for us, having this data was really critical to allow for the growth of the program in the way that you saw, and I displayed in some of the previous slides. The other thing, and why is that important? It's not just important for right-of-way management, but it's also related to the policy goals that we have as a city that I showed you on the first slide, which related to, our role as delivering outcomes like social outcomes, economic outcomes, equity outcomes. And one of the things in the analysis that we saw in the first year of the program is that companies did not deploy in areas that did not meet their business model. So areas that may be low income, that were not tourist destinations. And so using the data, we've really tried to kind of come full circle in this next year, using that analysis to develop new pricing models. So previously we did a vehicle fee, a per vehicle fee. We're now moving to a per trip fee, and we're doing a range of per trip fee depending on where the trip occurs. If it occurs in Venice Beach, you could get charged up to 40 cents per trip. If it happens in a low-income neighborhood that we've identified as an equity zone, then there would be no per trip fee. And so we're trying to use the data that we have to develop new public policy that achieves the outcomes that we want. We're also in this next year have a new compliance program that really looks to penalize and also incentivize those companies who are deemed to be good partners. And so some of those levers would be fleet increases if they're found to be in good compliance, or fleet reductions if they're found to be out of compliance. And then the last thing, as Jascha kind of referenced, and if you remember what I said earlier, we started this journey thinking about autonomous vehicles and urban aviation. And so, but we got to really test it out with scooters and micromobility, but we are in the process of bringing our taxis onto MDS. Our partner at the airport is really interested in looking at MDS for Uber and Lyft and taxis, because as you know, airports tend to be one of the biggest trip generators for those types of companies, and they want to get a better sense of managing that impact on airports. And then I think one of the key things that MDS has evolved into is that it's not just us receiving information, but it's us communicating information. And so as Jascha mentioned, there's the current work around coding the curve that we're interested in, because I think for us, we want to see, in the example of micromobility or transportation network companies or autonomous vehicles, we as a local city know the ins and outs of our city, and we're the ones adopting new curbside regulations. We want to be able to communicate that information in real time. We could also think about public safety. Here in Los Angeles, we had we tend to suffer at times amongst earthquakes. We also have wildfires that happen, and so recently, in the past year, there was a fire. And so we were quickly able to push out that information to all of the operators. Like, this is where a fire is occurring. Please do not deploy any vehicles here. And please, if possible, and if you can do so safely, remove your vehicles from these geographies. And so I think really trying to look at how do we actually have a better exchange in real time between the policies that we're adopting on our right-of-way with the new operators that are happening in partaking in the right-of-way here in the city. So that's the end of my presentation. I will send folks the link to the report in the chat. But thank you, everybody, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I do have to jump in. I have about 10, 15 minutes for questions, but you know, and I just want to, y también quería falar que a cidade de Los Angeles está aqui para aportar, para dar assistência, para viajar para Brasil quando as coisas melhoram. So thanks. So I'm open for any questions.
Obrigado, Marcel. Eu vou, agora seria o mercado, mas como o Marcel tem que sair, eu vou antecipar aí. Então está aberta a sessão de Q&A, de perguntas e respostas para o Marcel. Eu vou começar com uma do Paulo. Ele está querendo saber se é possível plugar cidadãos e empreendimentos privados ao MDS. Ele dá 2 exemplos específicos, quer dizer, um shopping center, por exemplo, que gostaria de subir, de alguma maneira, informação sobre a ocupação do seu estacionamento em tempo real, se isso seria possível. E um outro exemplo, né, uma rua, ele dá o exemplo da 25 de março em São Paulo, que não sei se é muito específica, mas são ruas de comércio que são muito lotadas, se você teria como monitorar pelo celular das pessoas o grau de lotação de uma rua comercial também, se esse tipo de feature existe já no MDS ou está em elaboração.
I think so there is, I think that comes to, I think the kind of code the curb work that is starting to emerge out of OMF and some of the working groups. And so I think that there will be a point in time where that communication does exist. And so I think, but I don't think MDS is like, it's a data specification, right? And so, so I think that it is up to partners, right, of the OMF, of the private sector, of cities, to help develop and expand the specification and agree upon kind of what the spec is, right, for that kind of to map out, to digitally map out those assets. And so I think that what MDS has focused on was to build out the vehicle part of the specification, but I think there is work to be done to map out the other assets, right? So for example, in Venice, I mentioned the special operations zone. And as a part of that, I told you that we had developed specific parking locations. So it was a physical parking location, but we digitized it. And so then the digital, there was now a digital component that was communicated to the operators. And so I think there is a way to do that. And it's part of, I think, the ongoing work streams. And so I would encourage folks who are interested in exploring that, particularly as I've always believed, and I continue to believe, a lot of the innovation, whereas I think the US was famous for, you know, like traffic signal timing or, you know, whatever it was, I also feel like Latin America and Asia has also, you know, led on innovation, right? The BRT, que a gente tem aqui em Los Angeles, foi inspirada por Curitiba, no? Transmilenio in Bogotá. And so I'm really interested, and I think one of the things that I cared so much about joining this conversation was because I know of the innovation that exists in Latin America and abroad. And so being able to have different voices from across the world to join in the conversations, I think is really critical. to evolving the spec, because as cities, we are more powerful together. Because one of the things that I saw is the private sector will go and legislate, right, and create legislation that prohibits the city from doing what it needs to do in terms of regulation. And so,
great. Uma pergunta do Nilson Oliveira. Ele, com esse tipo de avanço, é de se supor que furtos e roubos de veículos tenham caído e que a possibilidade de recuperação desses veículos tenha aumentado. Então, a pergunta dele é se vocês conseguem notar, aí seria uma medida de um efeito, side effect do MDS, se de fato reduziu o custo do seguro em LA, imagino que ele está perguntando, e se há outros aspectos que o MDS poderia colaborar em segurança pública, não em road safety, mas em public safety.
So insurance is an issue here as well in Los Angeles, in the United States. I think it's something that politically it's really easy to prioritize high insurance levels, particularly when you don't know what the potential impact has been. We have not done any type of actuarial study of on micromobility. I think it's going to need, like, when you think about all the things that I have to focus on, that I think is really something where the industry, the private sector, needs to come together to share information about the use of their vehicles, how they're used. We don't have a good way to collect crash information related to scooters yet. One could say that could be an evolution of the private sector using gyroscope technology, using accelerometer technology on their vehicles to start using that, and then present a case, maybe like an independent study, third-party study. But remember, these companies are competing. But when it's in their self-interest, they could, I think they should be doing that work. I think, public safety, I think positive externalities, again, of MDS is, we are able to, in a better way, manage the right-of-way. But I think it's also open to other research, right? And research that we may not be doing. So, for example, what is the life cycle of the vehicle, right? Some people have argued these vehicles last 2 weeks to 30 days, right? We have unique vehicle ID numbers, and so we could potentially do a longitudinal study about the life cycle of the vehicle. So that's one example of, but that's stuff that we wouldn't be able to do, right, if we weren't collecting that data. And so we're looking forward to later on in a few months releasing a public data set of our vehicles, of the program, but keeping in mind first and foremost privacy. And so some of that data is going to be aggregated. Yeah. So next question.
Pedro from Move It está perguntando como que o MDS interage com o transporte público.
So that is one of the work streams. We are looking and working with our transit operator and the company that provides the GPS for our transit to look and see how we could potentially evolve the spec to include public transit. Obviously we have GTFS, which is kind of the standard, but But I think for us, we're also, again, when you look at that real-time availability and being able to communicate with the public right-of-way, with the bus stop, for example, I think we're in the process of kind of building out what the use cases potentially could be, and also making the case for why not just use GTFS. And so I think that's also, Pedro, an ongoing part of this work and this discussion.
Guillermo, want to come back to the question, if you have some tips for cities willing to join MDS, given your experience.
You know, I think you can start by just talking to, you know, if you're a city, reach out to OMF, right? I think one of the things, for those of you who don't know the kind of the story fully, we had begun really, like, as I mentioned, we started MDS here in the city, but we recognized really quickly that we could not do this alone, nor should we do it alone. We had to expand it out to other cities. And one of the critiques that we heard from operators from the private sector was like, well, we don't have a voice, right? And we said, okay. And so the creation of the Open Mobility Foundation was very intentional in really seeding a board that was led by cities, but that invited private sector participation. And so I think the OMF is one way you should look at it. There's also, you're starting to see more and more vendors who are entering the space and selling software. Many of them are partners of the OMF. And so looking at how, you know, have them pitch you on what they would bring to you. Some cities are just using the software stack that some of these companies are bringing to manage dockless mobility. But again, if you're a city who does not have dockless, like scooter program, then you may have to think about another opportunity. One of the other things that I've seen, I think in cities that don't have staff capacity, is partnerships with universities. And so how do you partner with universities to build capacity for your own staff, right? And so I think that's another hot tip that I'd give.
Final question, again from Guillermo. How did you convince those TNCs to share their data? This is a mystery for Latin America, because they're sharing their data in the US, but they never share the data with us. So do you have something on that?
Well, they have not agreed. They have not agreed to share data with cities unless there is legal regulation, like regulatory requirements. They've not agreed. What's interesting is that some of them, both of them, well, I think Uber is no longer doing micromobility, but there was a point in time where both Uber and Lyft were operating in the city of Los Angeles micromobility, and they were complying with the mobility data specification. So they can do it because they've done it with scooters. They don't want to do it with their cars. And so I think that's going to be probably a theme over the next several years about how do you start getting that data, right? I think there's public policy reasons, there's regulatory compliance reasons, public safety, and so the use cases are there, but I think it's going to require some continued political muscle, right, and a collaboration, right? Like, you know, there are some cities that are just stronger and are willing to take that out. The other thing that I would look at, and again, I don't know what kind of jurisdiction, regulatory authority applies in TNCs. But generally in the United States, airports have autonomy to and are able to collect that data. So you may want to start with your what kind of partnerships do you have with your local airports?
Good tip. Obrigado de novo, Marcel, foi incrível. Eu agora vou passar para o pessoal, as empresas que mexem com esses dados, né, em São José, agradecendo novamente a cada um. Eu quero ouvir cada uma delas, o que elas sentiram, como que, enfim, o que elas gostariam de colocar em relação ao que a gente apresentou. Eu vou fazer em ordem alfabética, por falta de outra ordem melhor. Então, eu vou começar aqui com o Anderson Germano, da Serpro, ouvir o que ele tem a dizer, enfim, sem nenhum... não tem nenhum compromisso aí de falar muito. A gente está pensando aí, acho que a gente tem uns 5 minutos para cada um. E Anderson, agradecendo muito a sua presença.
Olá, bom dia a todos que estão me escutando, né? Então, como foi apresentado aqui, meu nome é Anderson Germano, sou do Serviço Federal de Processamento de Dados, né? Então, é uma empresa pública vinculada ao Ministério da Economia. Então, só para contextualizar um pouquinho, acho que a conversa foi muito pertinente, muito interessante para aquilo que a gente está desenvolvendo junto com São José dos Campos, né? Então, o CEP tem mais de 55 anos aí atendendo a esfera federal, e no setor de mobilidade a gente tem uma ampla experiência aí com dados nacionais, né? Vamos falar aí do DENATRAN, que é o Departamento Nacional de Trânsito, que é o órgão legislador aí do trânsito brasileiro, né? A gente atende também o DENIT, que é o Departamento Nacional de Infraestrutura. Então, vários modais acabam passando aí pelo cérebro, a gente consegue ter essa experiência aí aliada do federal também para estados e municípios, né? A NTT, temos negócio com a NTT, com a ANAC, que é a Agência Nacional de Aviação, ANTAC. Então, isso dá uma experiência nossa, e a gente viu que essa questão da MDS, né, a gente agora, uma das preocupações explanadas aí foi a questão da proteção do dado, né? Então, a gente está voltado também para a LGPD, né? A LGPD é algo que a gente tem bastante preocupação. Temos uma plataforma aí de anuência para fazer a gestão da anuência e para onde que foi feita essa anuência, né? Então, falando um pouquinho aqui do trânsito, né, em específico, essa parceria que a gente tem com São José dos Campos, recentemente a gente está fazendo uma POC lá, que é a questão do cercamento inteligente das cidades, né? Então, aproveitando esse dado, que é um dado bruto anonimizado, né, sem identificar o cidadão de fato, mas usar esse dado aí, que já é um dado que, querendo ou não, está acessível para São José dos Campos ou para qualquer outro município, e usar ele para melhoria da segurança pública, de melhoria das políticas públicas, né? Por exemplo, hoje passa vários veículos aí pelos radares semafóricos, e a gente consegue fazer a contabilização desses veículos, verificar se algum veículo não tem alguma restrição nessa base federal, municipal, estadual, aí, e permitir que um agente público possa fazer uma fiscalização mais assertiva e proativa, né? Pensando aí no MDS também, que é um outro projeto que a gente tem em desenvolvimento no Serpro, é a questão do IoT, né? Numa plataforma de IoT, né? Então, a gente sabe que o trânsito a gente fala que o trânsito é um dos setores aí da economia que mais IoTs tem, né? Então, é algo que a gente pensa, já está desenvolvendo uma plataforma para, tal qual o MDS, conversar e permitir que todos os dados desses IoTs sejam armazenados e compartilhados aí com os entes, tanto privados quanto públicos, para que eles não fiquem exclusivos, né? Claro que sempre com anuência e permissão dos órgãos, para que eles não fiquem exclusivos de um determinado órgão, e sim possibilite que eles sejam usados aí para melhoria do trânsito, melhoria da mobilidade, né, melhoria da política pública, como já comentado, né? Então, eu acho que é muito, muito interessante esse momento aí de São José dos Campos, sempre como sendo com esse DNA de inovação, né? Então, sempre que fazemos alguma proposta para o Paulo aí, ele sempre aceita e sempre nos contribui aí com a sua experiência aí que já tem nesse setor, né? Então, estamos muito felizes com essa parceria e estamos aí atentos a todas essas iniciativas e sempre colocando o SERPRO aí como sendo um ente aí que quer contribuir e quer estar presente nessas iniciativas também, né, com toda essa nossa experiência e unindo aí também, aproximando aí as esferas, né, estadual, federal e municipal aí para melhoria na transformação digital, tá? Eu acho que é isso que eu poderia colocar.
Muito obrigado, Anderson. Agora eu passo para o André Fauri, da BIBIP. Se possível, quem não estiver falando, desligar os microfones, e quem for falar, se puder ligar a câmera, tiver condições, também é bom, porque nós estamos gravando. Obrigado.
Olá, bom dia a todos. Primeiramente, obrigado aí, Paulo, Ciro, pelo convite. A BIBIP, né, é uma empresa de carros elétricos compartilhados. Então, a gente trouxe aí uma inovação muito grande, não só para a esfera aí de São José, mas como para o Brasil. E a gente sabe que quando a gente traz uma inovação muito grande dessas, a regulamentação precisa caminhar junto, né? Então, assim como Anderson falou, a gente ficou muito feliz quando a cidade de São José dos Campos, aí, através da Secretaria de Mobilidade, nos convidou para colocar o projeto na cidade, pelo DNA de inovação deles, né, que já é conhecido no país, e hoje esse projeto ele é modelo, tá, para o Brasil inteiro. Então, nosso desejo sempre foi trabalhar no sistema dockless, né? Então, quando eu trouxe a BIBIP para o Brasil, tivemos dificuldades em São Paulo. Hoje tem 1 ano que estamos operando em São Paulo e desde dezembro do ano passado em São José dos Campos. Porém, em São Paulo havia a licitação da Zona Azul, tivemos algumas dificuldades para colocar o projeto de dockless, então trabalhamos inicialmente no projeto de Station Based, né, com cerca de 60 estações, operando 60 estações em shopping centers, hotéis, prédios comerciais e tudo mais. Quando eu conversei com o Felício e com o Paulo, né, um pouquinho antes de dezembro, e também pela agilidade que a gente colocou esse projeto, acho que é importante destacar, o modelo de São José já era destaque, porque eles já tinham um modelo de decreto para os carros elétricos compartilhados, que inclusive eu utilizei para outras cidades depois como um modelo, e isso foi importantíssimo, porque questões como placas de carros elétricos hoje são discutidas, como operar como operar o car sharing no Brasil, né? Então, a gente teve o apoio da prefeitura aí muito grande, tá? Hoje, é a única cidade brasileira que possui o sistema de carros elétricos compartilhados dockless. Então, a gente tem um apoio muito grande aí no compartilhamento de dados, que eu acho que é importantíssimo para as cidades, né? Que poder planejar aí a infraestrutura futura dessa nova mobilidade. Ao mesmo tempo, a gente compartilha com eles aí viagens, tempos de deslocamentos, horários de maior e menor demanda. Então, isso, como MDS, é importantíssimo que se padronize, né? Então, acho que é tudo muito novo no Brasil. Acho que São José dos Campos aí tá dando exemplo para outras cidades, mas a gente realmente precisa padronizar isso na medida que novos modais aparecem, né? Então, primeiramente com a micromobilidade, aí, patinetes, bicicletas, aprendemos muito do compartilhamento. Agora a gente está numa outra revolução aí, que é da eletrificação, e vamos caminhar também para a revolução dos carros autônomos. Então, quando a gente traz esse nível de inovação, como eu disse antes, é importantíssimo essa parceria público-privado, né? Então, a gente vem trabalhando fortemente aí com a Secretaria de Mobilidade, e é importantíssimo também a questão da privacidade dos dados. Então, acho que a gente vai ter aí um campo muito grande ainda de discussão e padronização de todo esse conceito, né?
Muito obrigado, André, pela participação e pela fala. Agora eu passo para o Ângelo Leite, da Sertel. sei se o Ângelo não está. Não sei. Bom, se ele aparecer depois, ele pode falar depois, ou se ele não está conseguindo falar. Então, eu pulo para o Elgio Trindade, da Digicom, para fazer a sua fala.
Alô, vocês me ouvem? Ok, tudo bom. Bom, em primeiro lugar, agradecer, né, a oportunidade, aí, o convite, né, de vocês para a gente participar desse evento, né, e poder também contribuir um pouquinho com o que a Digicom está fazendo. A nossa parceria com o São José dos Campos, ela é realmente uma parceria de longa data, né, e a gente tem trazido várias questões aí nessa questão da mobilidade que eu acredito que possam ser integradas justamente nesse discurso, né. Eu acredito que essas iniciativas que São José está tendo de forma pioneira na questão dessas padronizações de tecnologias, sistemas abertos, são realmente inovadoras. Eu acho que isso vai servir de modelo aí para muitas cidades no Brasil, né? Isso está na característica, no DNA, como Paulo Guimarães mesmo falou, né? da cidade. E dentro dessa linha, né? E desses pilares aí de simplicidade, compartilhamento de recursos, inovação, gestão aberta, eu acredito que nós da Digicom estamos muito alinhados com essa visão, né? E acreditamos muito na integração desses diversos elementos e modais da mobilidade, né? Então, a gente tem em São José equipamentos instalados na parte de estacionamento rotativos, né? Que são chamados parquímetros, que estão evoluindo para terminais inteligentes, né? São equipamentos hoje que têm uma capacidade de comunicação via 3G, 4G, painel solar para recarga, né? Então, eles podem ser encarados como um terminal, né, inteligente para mobilidade, justamente para integração com o sistema de transporte coletivo, por exemplo. Eles podem ser um sistema de emissão de passagens unitárias com QR Code ou, eventualmente, recarga de cartões. Poderiam ser também sistemas para solicitação de transporte sob demanda, né, porque eles têm a sua localização fixa e também ali mesmo poderia ser feito já o pagamento da passagem, né. Também podem servir como recarga para carros elétricos, né, embora São José tenha aí um sistema bem inteligente onde os carros não precisam ser carregados, mas no futuro, quando as pessoas tiverem seus próprios veículos, ao estacioná-las, já pode optar por um serviço adicional de solicitar recarga através do terminal do totem. E aí se pode imaginar em pagamentos de contas municipais, pagamentos de contas integradas ao Detran, que seria voltados justamente aos veículos, né, que isso facilitaria muito a vida dos usuários e também colocaria novas funcionalidades nos terminais hoje existentes, que a inteligência está lá disponível, né. E aí, falando um pouco também da nossa área de trânsito, há muitos anos a gente tem equipamentos em São José, acho que foram uma das cidades que também sempre batalhou muito por inovação e ter sistemas com detecção de veículos, com sistemas com contagem. Isso acho que foi sempre uma busca aí de São José, e o Paulo sempre teve muito à frente desses projetos, né? E nós temos hoje um sistema adaptativo, né, inteligente, né, que é o SCATS, integrado aos nossos controladores. E isso também traz muitas possibilidades na integração com o transporte público também, que eu acho que é um dos objetivos maiores hoje que a gente está vendo nas cidades, né? Não só falando de ônibus, mas todos esses modais que a gente está vendo, que foram falados da micromobilidade, os próprios pedestres, os ciclistas, né? Então, a importância desses sistemas com a manutenção da segurança de todos esses elementos, e integração também com o transporte público na busca da prioridade, né, do aumento da fluidez, da redução dos tempos de viagem, aumento das velocidades médias, que isso são dados comprovados. E nessa questão do MDS, toda essa parte de base de dados que é gerada, né, com contagem de veículos, contagem dos próprios veículos de transporte público, integração com as informações de contagem de passageiros que esses veículos estão transportando. Então, acho que nessa linha a gente enxerga bastante, né, a aderência, né, nesse grande Big Data que pode ser transformado e utilizar isso como ferramenta para planejamento da mobilidade do município, né? Então, acho que é mais ou menos essa nossa visão, essa nossa contribuição, né, e dizer que nós estamos aí à disposição sempre para buscar aí novidades nessa linha, nesse sentido, né, para a gente ter cidades melhores, né, cidades com mobilidades mais humanas e mais inteligentes também. Acho que essa é a mensagem.
Muito obrigado, Elgio. Agora eu vou passar para o Fernando Baltazar, da Fotossensores, que não sabíamos que estaria, mas vamos ver se a gente consegue passar para ele, porque não recebemos a confirmação antes. Eu só vou lembrar que quem for falar, mude onde tem interpretação, embaixo, à direita, você ou desliga ou coloca em português, senão você acaba sobrepondo a tradução, fica ruim para escutar. Então, vamos ver se a gente consegue que o Francisco Baltazar fale. Não sei se é possível.
Alô, alô? Alô? Estão ouvindo?
Perfeitamente.
Muito bem. Senhores, é um prazer ter a oportunidade de ser convidado para participar de um grupo tão eclético e tão dominador dos temas aqui expostos. A Fotossensores Tecnologia é uma empresa localizada aqui no Parque Tecnológico de São José dos Campos. Nós somos uma empresa que atua no setor de radares, somos pioneiros neste setor no Brasil e hoje migramos para a segurança pública. Haja vista o Big Data, que é formado com as leituras que nós fazemos, não só em São José dos Campos, como em muitas cidades do Brasil. Nós começamos, como dito, fazendo radares nessa área de mobilidade urbana, onde nossos radares produzem dados abertos que são entregues ao gestor de trânsito com muitas informações de engenharia. Velocidade média, fluxo, identificação dos veículos, classificação, em si, tudo aquilo que uma engenharia de trânsito precisa para uma cidade inteligente, nós fornecemos esses dados através dos vários pontos que nós temos, no caso aqui em São José dos Campos, por exemplo. Com o passar do tempo, esse produto ele evoluiu para um Big Data. Ou seja, em São José dos Campos, como exemplo, nós temos de 800 a 1 milhão de leituras de placas por dia. Aquelas placas, aqueles veículos que cometeram infração, eles geram infração que a autoridade de trânsito envia para o infrator. E o que fazer com os demais elementos? Então, essas informações são jogadas em um grande Big Data, e esse Big Data nós desenvolvemos um BI que é capaz de, com o auxílio da inteligência policial, identificar veículos roubados e mais, fazer uma ação preventiva ou preditiva. Nós temos condições de identificar veículos suspeitos e essa informação ser enviada para a autoridade de trânsito ou para a autoridade policial, que aqui em São José é um caso de sucesso no que diz respeito à redução não só de acidentes pelos radares, mas também como a criminalidade e a redução de roubos de carros e tudo mais. Então, esses dados não são nossos, esses dados são da nossa contratante, que é o Dr. Paulo Guimarães, e tem servido de grande auxílio tanto para esta cidade como para outras cidades do Brasil, estados e até contratos nacionais onde nós estamos presentes. Então, Paulo, agradeço a você pelo convite, nos pomos à disposição, Dr. Paulo Guimarães tem nossos contatos, e eu afirmo com certeza que informações sobre a empresa e sobre o nosso produto, nada como perguntar a um cliente que é o Dr. Paulo. Muito obrigado, senhores.
Muito obrigado, João. Nós estamos aqui com um tempo bem apertado e ainda temos aqui mais 1, 2, 3 participantes. Então, queria pedir para ficar em 5 minutos, como os outros. E não esquecer de realmente apertar o off lá para que fique fácil de escutar quem estiver usando com tradução. Então, a gente passa agora para o João Franqueto, da DataPro. Obrigado. Acredito que o João não está, então eu passo para o Pedro Palhares, da Movit.
Boa tarde a todos. Bom, primeiro eu queria agradecer o convite do Ciro, o convite do Paulo para participar aqui desse evento, dar os parabéns por essa abertura para, vamos dizer assim, abrir esse conhecimento para as pessoas. Eu sou do mercado, não conheci o MDS, achei super interessante, estou super curioso como isso pode ajudar na informação do transporte público, né, que é e como isso pode chegar na ponta para o passageiro, para melhorar o dia a dia deles aí. Então, eu queria agradecer vocês, já estamos quase na hora do almoço, um monte de gente deve estar com fome aí, eu vou ser super breve, Ciro, e queria agradecer e dar parabéns aí. Obrigado, abraço.
Ótimo, Pedro. Também estamos aqui ansiosos para o MDS entrar mais firme no transporte público. Bom, terminamos com o Sérgio Prodocimo, ou Prodocimo, não sei, da Decklink. Acho que não teremos tempo para mais perguntas do público, infelizmente. E, mais uma vez, agradeço a todos os participantes, todo mundo do mercado aqui que veio e se manifestou aí favorável de tentar ter um protocolo aberto e comum. Então, a gente ainda faz um encerramento aqui em breve, mas vamos antes ouvir o Sérgio agradecendo a participação de mais esse membro. Acho que o Sérgio estava aí, mas enfim. Bom, se alguém ainda aparecer aqui nos próximos minutos, avise e podem entrar. Eu acho que tem mais alguém que eu esqueci, que quer falar. Acho que Sérgio Queiroz tem aqui. Bom, então, dado isso, mais uma vez, acho que foi um evento muito bom, muito interessante, importante aqui, né, como foi colocado ali pela OMF, a mobilidade, nos últimos 10 anos, mudou muito, né, comparado com os 50 anos anteriores, e vai seguir mudando, a gente está começando a assistir isso. Então, é fundamental aqui a gente começar a se preparar, começar a nos digitalizar para isso, e essa é uma das alternativas em que ela é mais igualitária, no sentido de que ela permite uma comunicação em via dupla, no sentido de que ela é aberta, não é um protocolo de uma empresa em particular, por isso a gente acredita que essa tenha o potencial dessa solução seja bastante relevante. Eu vou passar aqui, então, para o William falar suas últimas palavras, e acho que o Paulo pode encerrar aí como o host de São José, essa cidade que está à frente do seu tempo.
Não, eu não tenho mais para falar. Estou para este diálogo, muitas informações, e obrigado para todos para sua participação, e só isso.
Obrigado, William. Paulo, umas palavras finais aí.
Bom, Ciro, eu quero agradecer, eu acho que foi super produtivo, né, principalmente para as pessoas do Brasil que conseguiram participar aqui do nosso web, né, porque o MDS ainda é uma coisa muito nova aqui no Brasil, né, a gente teve até algumas perguntas relacionadas a como fazer as empresas abrirem os seus dados, e eu acho que a gente está caminhando para isso, né, a gente ter o MDS muito presente no nosso próximo sistema de transporte público, eu acho que é fundamental para que a gente consiga ter ganhos nas 3 esferas, né? O poder público, né, gerando mais conhecimento e melhorando a prestação de serviço para a população, a própria população que tem aí possibilidades infinitas, né, de melhoria na receptividade desse serviço, de usar, acima de tudo, a mobilidade, principalmente, mas tudo aquilo que envolve as cidades inteligentes em torno do MDS, enfim. Eu acho que a gente tem um ganho muito grande, principalmente para a população e para as empresas também, né? Que as empresas possam cada vez mais desenvolver os seus produtos, né? Prestar o seu serviço aí em parceria com os órgãos públicos. Então, acho que é uma forma da gente ter ganhos em todas as esferas. Estou muito satisfeito com o andamento das coisas, né? E de colocar São José como um grande laboratório, no bom sentido, lógico, dessas novas experiências, e reforçar aí o nosso compromisso com a inovação, com a abertura da cidade e com a abertura das portas da cidade e da Secretaria de Mobilidade para tudo aquilo que se traduza em benefícios para o cidadão, principalmente, que é o nosso principal objetivo aqui. Muito obrigado a todos aí, devolvo a palavra para o Ciro para um encerramento final.
Bom, também nada mais a adicionar, agradecer uma vez mais a participação de todos. Eu também achei muito produtivo, foi um evento com essa ideia de oficina mesmo, para que o MDS, que ainda é muito inicial no Brasil, não tem nenhuma cidade e logo terá, mas que fique conhecido tanto das empresas que vão ser parceiros relevantes, né? Isso, o MDS tem implícito nele uma parceria público-privada, e que isso aí tenha bons andamentos em prol da inovação e da transparência. Obrigado a todos e até logo.